You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Hello and welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today we're diving into a remarkable story of perseverance, collaboration, and a father's determination to save his child. A story that has now led to a finalist spot in the AUTM Better World Project. We are talking about Danyelza, also known as naxitamab, a life-saving immunotherapy for pediatric neuroblastoma developed at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, also known as MSK. To tell this story, we are joined by three key figures from MSK who shepherded this breakthrough from the lab bench to the bedside. First, we have Dr. Cheung. Dr. Cheung is the Enid A. Haupt Chair in Pediatric Oncology and head of the Memorial Hospital Research Laboratories and MSK. A world-renowned pediatric hematologist-oncologist, he has dedicated decades to developing antibody-based therapies for childhood cancers. Joining him is Dr. Yashodhara Dash, the Vice President of Entrepreneurship and Commercialization at MSK. With a background in both medicine and business, Dr. Dash leads the institution's technology transfer office, overseeing the complex process of turning MSK's intellectual property into tangible treatments for patients. And rounding out our panel is Dr. Imke Ehlers-Surur, Director of Technology Development and Licensing at MSK. As the licensing manager who worked directly with Dr. Cheung, she has handled this project's intricate journey throughout its development. And for the purposes of disclosure, MSK and Dr. Cheung have financial interests in Danyelza. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Cheung, Dr. Dash, and Dr. Ehlers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, really excited to have you on the podcast. And again, congratulations on your Better World Project nomination. And Dr. Cheung, I thought the best place to start the podcast is with you and to just have you kind of set the stage here to help our listeners understand what neuroblastoma is and why this particular cancer has been so difficult to treat, especially in high-risk children.
Thank you again. I'll try to explain a bit. This is a very tough cancer called neuroblastoma that develops from these immature nerve cells in infants and young children. It usually originates in the adrenal gland and actually anywhere along the sympathetic nervous system. It popped up in the abdomen, in the chest, or sometimes in the neck. It's most common solid tumor outside the brain in children. Unfortunately, more than half of this tumor, they spread to the bone, which is painful, to the bone marrow, lowering the blood counts, to the liver, and sometimes even the brain. And when these things are metastatic, meaning it's spread to different organs, it is actually very difficult to cure. It has all the hallmarks of cancer. And I'd say in the early days, it's one of the most difficult and tragic cancer to take care of, and patients suffer.
It sounds like an absolutely horrible cancer for young children to have. And I know this was a disease that you were working on for many, many years. And in fact, you started working on antibodies that would become Danyelza back in the mid-1990s. Take us back to that time when you started working on this particular antibody. What was the aha moment in the lab when you realized that targeting GD2 could potentially work?
Well, you go back decades ago, I was still, I guess, young. I could see the despair, the hopelessness, and the agony of really the young parents who really make some really difficult decisions in their life to put their child with neuroblastoma through these toxic treatments. They all hope for a cure, but they rarely came. And those are the old days. So like many pediatric oncologists, I know I have a personal responsibility, especially when I prescribe these toxic medicines and not able to deliver. So, when you're face to face with what we call this emperor of all maladies, chills run down your back. I was desperate. I searched everywhere and there was not real hope or help in sight. So I just dug up my toolbox, from my MD PhD days at Harvard and at Stanford. And I started making antibodies, to fight neuroblastoma, just like fighting infections with antibiotics. A very maybe simple, naive idea. But from there, we actually did develop antibodies, and 3 of 8 was the aha moment when I felt the true lift from the depth of my depression. And within a few years, we were able to see how this antibody can light up tumors in patients and actually eliminate some of the metastatic disease that spread to the bone marrow. And so, we start using the word we because it's not really a one-man show. It takes a team of dedicated researchers, nurses, and doctors to really get these antibodies from the bench to the bedside.
Yeah, and many, many years. Like you said, you started in the mid-1990s and we're now in the 2020s. I mean, that was a long, hard, arduous journey for sure, I would say. And like you said, it took a dedicated team to do this. And, Danyelza is a humanized monoclonal antibody. So maybe for the non-scientists that are listening to this podcast, talk to us a little bit about how this antibody actually works inside a child's body to help it fight that cancer that you were talking about, that horrible, horrible, painful cancer.
So over these decades, we began to see that patients are responding to the antibody. But unfortunately, the antibody called 3 of 8, the early version of Danyelza, was a mouse antibody. So they get rejected by the body. So we turn it into a human-like form using protein engineering. And this is what we call the humanized 3 of 8 and later actually called Danyelza. This is an antibody which is much more tolerable, is not rejected as often, and able to arm the body's killer cells and arm the body's killer proteins to fight neuroblastoma. So, again, those days, antibody engineering, it's a self-taught idea because, there was so much uncertainty then. And especially there was really not much financial support unless you are a big pharma. So we in the academic center, we work with small budgets. And besides the fact that the science is actually difficult, the lack of funding was really tough. So we rely heavily on support from internal grants, from parents group. And I need to mention one of those groups is called the Band of Parents. This is a group of parents that they come together and basically refuse to see their children suffer from this disease. And they would say, let's do it together. Let's go and find something that's better for the children. And that's how this whole Danyelza idea, humanized antibody program moved forward.
Yeah, we're going to get to that part of the story because ultimately it was the father of a daughter who had this terrible disease that ultimately commercialized this antibody. And it's an incredible story. But, you talked about the lack of funding, and that leads me to turn to Dr. Dash here for a second, because I know, Dr. Dash, you're very familiar with innovations getting stuck in the valley of death between discovery and a commercial product. So when Dr. Cheung came to you and his team came to you and your office, what did the commercial landscape for this antibody look like? And were pharma companies lining up, or was it a hard sell?
I would say it was a hard sell. The proof of concept data was in an early stage. It was in the ultra-orphan market, and it can be extremely difficult to find an appropriate partner for a technology for this market. But it was even more difficult a couple of decades ago. Antibodies were not as fashionable. Most companies we talked to were looking for small molecules, which are easier and cost less to manufacture. I would say there was a lack of FDA incentives for companies to address these very, very small markets. An instrument called a priority review voucher, which made commercialization of such drugs more attractive, was introduced for pediatric drugs only in 2012. Dr. Cheung was very proactive in applying for the appropriate designation for this drug and also, of course, in advancing the technology as far as possible internally at MSK. And it's really his persistence and entrepreneurial mindset that kept this project going internally. We probably required a tighter data set for the drug and some further improvements on the antibody, which ultimately allowed us to solidify our IP position, and generation of more clinical data and maybe just the landscape changing somewhat ultimately led us to find the appropriate partner.
Yeah, and I want to get to that part of the story. And Dr. Ehlers, I hinted at this a little bit before because it is a very unique story about who licensed this technology. And I hinted it was the father of one of Dr. Cheung's patients. Talk to us about the formation of the startup Y-mAbs Therapeutics and how this technology got there and how it is evolved to the product it is today.
Yeah, indeed. It was, in the end, a father of a young patient of Dr. Cheung's. And like many patients, like many families, especially facing pediatric cancer, Thomas Gadd experienced firsthand both the devastating limitations of existing treatments, but also the promise of the science, in this case, emerging from Dr. Cheung's lab. And rather than remaining a passive observer, he made the decision to team up with Dr. Cheung and help build a company around the technology to ensure that this humanized anti-GD2 antibody could move forward when other paths had stalled, to make sure that other children would also benefit from this treatment that at that time was only available at MSK in clinical trials. So that was extraordinary, and it was very humbling, right? It's a very humbling experience for a tech transfer manager to work in this situation. The urgency and the mission alignment is absolute and palpable throughout the entire conversations at the beginning, but throughout the entire negotiation process. So from a licensing perspective, it meant for MSK that we were working with a founder who had unparalleled motivation, and who also, but it also meant that the founder, who had limited experience in drug development, he had commercial experience, but limited experience in U.S. drug development. So he benefited from a strong institutional partnership, and it helped him navigate IP strategy and regulatory planning, and also the long-term development to a certain extent. So it was complex, and our office developed and supported a forward-looking commercialization strategy, including what I said, the IP portfolio, and also a sustained collaboration with MSK clinicians and development teams. So within a few years of that licensing, we were very lucky that Y-mAbs had brought together a very strong team and completed a successful IPO 3 years after licensing. It was really remarkable.
It was incredible, and it really goes to show sometimes the dedication of parents of sick children and how far they're willing to go. And I think it's a remarkable story. But I want to also ask you, as a licensing professional, I'm sure you faced a lot of unique challenges, some of which you mentioned, but some benefits as well, right, of negotiating a license with a startup basically founded by a patient family versus, a traditional VC-backed team. So talk to us about some of the challenges and the benefits there.
If you take the traditional VC firm as a yardstick, yes, you are in a little bit of an untraditional environment. Thomas Gadd came with this absolutely remarkable motivation. The biggest difference, I suppose, is that you're not negotiating with entrepreneurs or institutional investors. So you have to make sure that your communication, that you're speaking the same language, right? That you're aligned and very clear in what the needs of each party are. We went through several iterations with this, and that we worked very hard with him on aligning on what is the best team to move forward to make MSK comfortable that this will work. And he was able to crystallize really a team with profound drug development experience around this asset. And that made us very optimistic that this would actually work.
Yeah, it sounds like both sides really wanted this to work and were willing to do whatever it took to try and get it to work. So it sounds like there was a lot of education on your side for Mr. Gadd, but once you got there, it sounded like you built a comfort level amongst each other and things just kind of synergized and took off from there.
I think it was education maybe going both ways, actually, because he came with extraordinary investors from Europe, not large firms, but individuals with a long-term investment horizon, and that also, once we were comfortable with that proved, I think, a very important part of the success of Y-mAbs ultimately. That he had such dedicated investors on his end, right? The story he could tell was very, very powerful. So I do think that education really went both ways.
That's great. It really shows when dedicated people who want to make an impact and affect change, what you can do if you're willing to educate one another and communicate. And it sounds like both of those were strong on both sides.
Maybe add one more thing. And another point that I thought was really strong in this story and was a really big part of the success is that Dr. Cheung and Thomas Gadd were working well together, and Thomas and his team, especially at the beginning, since there was such a strong mission alignment, he really listened to Dr. Cheung and to the MSK clinical team's vision of how to get this drug to approval. And I thought that was a really powerful alignment and important for the success of Danyelza ultimately.
Absolutely. It sounds like that was one of the keys for sure. And I think also probably de-risking was another big issue. And Dr. Dash, I want to turn to you and ask you about that because I know MSK has its own mechanisms to de-risk technologies like the Technology Development Fund. Did internal funding play a role in helping to keep this project alive before the startup was formed, given what you were saying about some of the challenges in terms of industry wanting a small molecule instead of a biologic?
I'm glad you mentioned the TDF, which does provide critical gap funding to many of our promising new ideas. MSK did provide some gap funding through the TDIF to this particular project. However, the real story here is definitely funding Dr. Cheung received from philanthropic groups, including from the Band of Parents, the group of motivated families of pediatric neuroblastoma patients that he mentioned earlier. MSK does have other types of support available beyond direct funding, such as help in writing and filing IND applications. These are necessary to be filed with the FDA to get approval to start a clinical trial. We also have a very mature clinical trial infrastructure with support from clinicians, researchers, and administrators. And I believe that all of these elements aligned at the right time and really helped to propel this technology forward.
Yeah, again, it's an incredible, incredible story. And Dr. Cheung, I want to turn back to you now because I know you've overseen more than 30 clinical trials and that Danyelza received FDA accelerated approval, as mentioned, back in November 2020. What was it like for you to finally cross the finish line during the height of the pandemic? That must have been an interesting kind of experience.
Well, I mean, yeah. So you can sort of sense there's a, of all the background, there's a convergence of really forces. We have a terrible cancer that we need to take care of. We have a potential drug that may help, but we run into all these hurdles of regulatory and financial. And while on one hand we've been really encouraged by the responses that we are seeing in patients, but that obviously that news spread, and we actually getting so many patients coming to Memorial. We running out of drugs. We manufacture in the past, not for the world. We only do make enough for our, maybe small number of patients on the trial. So that was a very important consideration that we keep running out of a drug. And I always compare that to the Schindler's List. And that actually happened to us one time where we had to check off basically who are the patients that would potentially benefit. And that was a moment that we realized we had to get this out. We had to make sure that the drug, if it's going to be useful, has to be made so that's available for everybody, so that they don't have to come to Memorial and come to New York, because even though the drug is given to the patients for free, they still had to pay for some of the other expenses, traveling, the hospital, the clinic. So it's not sustainable in my mind. So this is why we really start talking about or thinking about try to get this out in some way. So those 30 years of clinical trials gave us some insight into how to get drug development from bench to the bedside, learning from the mistakes and the failures that we have. And finally, we decided to join force with Thomas to try to get the humanized GBA to the public in 2015, which is only maybe, a decade ago. But the first thing I had to do was actually to step out of the clinic, because there is a potential conflict of interest when you form any company or help form any company to develop drugs. And that's how I was upset that I just had to step out completely, so that there's no more conflict of interest as we push this drug forward. So I devoted my full time to the research lab to improve these kind of therapeutics even further. It was fortunate that Y-mAbs, the company, was able to go public 3 years from the inception, and then the drug was approved in 2020, which is actually very fast, which is great, because I was really happy that patients can now get the drug without having to come to New York, because that's a critical part of all this. Having to be able to get a drug at home is so much easier for the family. But the thing is that I keep reminding ourselves that our mission at Memorial is to end cancer for life, and not just for one patient, but for all patients if possible. So this is why we, basically focus on the lab to continue to innovate, to make treatments much more tolerable, less toxic, and maybe even more effective. Well, I think we've been fortunate to actually develop even more effective therapy since then. And I'm looking forward really to get these into the clinic as fast as we can, because every patient that came to us with a clock. And we had to beat the clock somehow. And that's as urgent as anything else. And that has never left me, that I just need to keep going and accelerate the process as much as we can.
Well, thank you for that, because I have a nephew who had leukemia and was at Cohen's Children's Hospital on Long Island. He was diagnosed at 8. He's doing well today, but it's thanks to doctors and researchers like you who are helping to solve children's cancers, which, as we mentioned at the outset, they're horrible cancer's horrible for anybody to go through, but for children, it's even worse. And if you've ever been, which I know you have been, in a oncology unit in a hospital, a children's hospital, it's a tough place to be. So thank you for all your dedication on products like Danyelza and everything else that you're doing right now. So we look forward to see what's coming next. But I want to turn back to Danyelza for a second here. And Dr. Ehlers, ask you, we've mentioned that this drug received multiple special designations. It got the breakthrough therapy. It also received orphan drug approval, rare pediatric disease. So from a tech transfer perspective, how important were these regulatory incentives in helping to make the business case for the startup?
That is such a great question. This is another major puzzle piece in the story. In my opinion, these designations were absolutely critical. I would say transformative for the business case. When we're evaluating whether to license early stage academic research to a startup, we're essentially doing a risk-reward calculation. And pediatric rare diseases are notoriously challenging from a commercial standpoint. The numbers are just not there. The patient populations are small, clinical trials are complex, and the path to profitability traditionally looks very uncertain. But some of these aspects because of the regulatory designations, fundamentally changed the equation. So, for example, and I should say that Dr. Cheung's team here has been truly ahead of many other teams elsewhere in the US in exploring this and pursuing this and educating. I would say, Dr. Cheung, you really educated the clinical research team, right, in supporting these, creating the data, creating the application. So that was a huge lift by his team under his leadership, right? So we did get, and then some of it was taken on by Y-mAbs, but the foundations were truly led, I think, by Dr. Cheung and his team at MSK. So we received orphan drug designation, which gave us 7 years of market exclusivity post-approval. That's huge when you're trying to have this path, right, is huge when you're trying to attract investors to a startup. We also got breakthrough therapy designation, which means that the FDA would provide intensive guidance and potentially accelerate the review timeline, and that could shave years of development and save millions in costs. And then last but not least, we got the rare pediatric disease designation, and that came with a priority review voucher. These vouchers are basically tradable commodities, and at the time could be sold for somewhere between 80 and 150 million. Was about the time that we were getting one through Y-mAbs, or even more. Like some companies were able to sell them for over 300 million. For a startup, that's not just a nice to have, right? This is potentially a significant return event that can validate the entire investment thesis. And from our tech transfer office's perspective, these designations meant that we could go to a potential licensee and say, yes, this is a small population. We are in an ultra-orphan space, but here's a clear regulatory path with FDA support, market exclusivity protection, and a tangible asset in the PRV if all goes well. Without these incentives, honestly, I'm not sure this deal could have happened in that way. The startup may just not have been fundable. On the other hand, Thomas Gadd is a force of nature, so maybe he would have been able to find a way, but it certainly helped to have this the setup. And hence, we are also very, very excited that Congress just extended this priority review voucher program for rare pediatric diseases that came through on February 3rd, and it's going to be in place until 2029. So we're cheering for that.
Yeah, we're cheering to see what else Dr. Cheung comes up with between now and then as well for pediatric cancer. So pressure's on Dr. Cheung. And, in addition to all that, we mentioned before, Y-mAbs went public in 2018. And I believe it was last year that I saw that they were acquired by CERB Pharmaceuticals. So, Dr. Dash, I want to turn to you and ask you what this commercial success means for MSK's ability to fund future research from Dr. Cheung as well as others there.
Yeah, absolutely. CERB has a large team that's experienced in marketing and selling approved drugs. So we're quite optimistic that this acquisition will have a positive impact on proceeds from Danyelza sales that come back to MSK. And those proceeds will, of course, be plowed back into further cancer research to fund our mission. This is a typical life cycle of new drug ideas originating from MSK. We generally tend to have earlier stage technologies, which we partner license to smaller biotechs, or we will sometimes start our own companies around these early stage technologies. And then once they are closer to the market, if successful, then these biotechs tend to be acquired by larger companies, which are better positioned to market and sell drugs. And I think that's what we're seeing here. So we're quite optimistic.
So, Dr. Cheung, I want to turn back to you for a second because we've been talking a lot about commercialization, but at the end of the day, this is about children, and you are extremely dedicated to children. It's very obvious as we've been talking here. Is there a particular patient story that sticks with you that exemplifies why your work has been so important?
Finding a drug or a cure for a child so that he or she can reach the full potential in life I think is priceless. You can't measure them in dollars. I mean, I know their designations, accolades, these drug breakthrough designations. I think all these sort of pat on the back on our backs just to tell us everything that we're doing is really worth it. It helps our spirit, it replenish our energy, and invigorate really us to keep marching forward. I can never forget some of the anguish the parents really go through, trying to decide whether their child should go or they should consent to a toxic therapy. So decades ago, I remember, there was a patient. These are the days when the allogeneic stem cell transplant for neuroblastoma was really not that sophisticated. So most patients actually die. And for those that survive, they had to bear some of the devastating side effects of graft versus host disease, which is part of the side effect from allogeneic stem cell transplant. So I remember the father, who was a physician, and he had seen all the outcomes from these treatments, but he wasn't given any choice in a sense. His child, a young adolescent daughter, actually was all he had. So he struggled with that decision, and he cried, and I cried inside with him. But as a junior attending, I really don't have much say, as to what is the option for them. So as predicted, the patient went through the transplant, the cancer did not respond, but the graft versus host disease started kicking in, and she suffered, and he was devastated, the father. Well, we actually did give her the antibody, and miraculously, the antibody actually sent the tumor away. The tumor disappeared. But then the GVHD, which is the graft versus host disease, took over, and she suffered a painful death. And the father, years later, still could not get over his decision when he had actually no options. So that was an experience that I have felt early on, and I keep feeling it every day when I was in the clinic. There's just so much toxicity that we are giving to our patients, and some of these early toxicities, some of these are late toxicities. Some of these like second cancers that our patients are at risk. So to me, we just had to keep going and keep making better drugs that are not toxic, equally effective, so that they can live a reasonable quality of life once they hopefully get cured. So I always said that I won't live 100 years to see them celebrate their 95th birthday. But at least I should be able to try to do something now so that that future for them is not as bleak as we are seeing now. So that, to me, was something that had stayed with me for all this time, and I just couldn't get over it.
Well, thank you very much for sharing. And again, thank you for all the incredible work that you're doing. And, I mentioned at the outset about the AUTM Better World Project, and Danyelza was nominated as a finalist, and congratulations again. I wanted to ask the three of you, what message do you hope this story sends to other TTOs about the importance of persisting with rare or orphan disease indications? And maybe Dr. Cheung, I'll start with you.
Well, I think, as you can see already, when there's a convergence of mission, a convergence of purpose, and you can see from this, the story on Danyelza, is many people participating. So when you have purpose, you have passion, your flame will continue to burn. And I hope that flame to be eternal. And I think we have to do more, and I should do more.
Dr. Dash, would you like to add some comments to that?
Yeah, but basically to echo what Dr. Cheung said, I mean, this type of story is precisely what makes our job so meaningful. To see a technology conceived at MSK mature, take shape, and then ultimately be turned into a drug, which treats the most challenging conditions in perhaps the most vulnerable population, is truly gratifying. I think it's the type of thing that gets us out of bed in the morning. And so the message to other tech transfer offices is that the challenges and setbacks are really well worth the trouble because of stories like this.
Absolutely. Dr. Ehlers, how about you?
Yeah, it's more of the same. It was really in the end when we're looking back, a bit of magic, but it was also the persistence and insistence on teamwork, right? The success story is not just for Dr. Cheung and our office. There were so many other departments involved, and obviously a phenomenal group in the MSK Pediatrics department, but so many beyond that worked together. And because of this mission alignment, even before Y-mAbs, it was a great and very powerful group working together that really, turned a very, very challenging situation into something manageable. Magic too, but manageable.
In some ways, it was magical because you were able to help so many kids.
Exactly. And I think the importance of philanthropy and the power of parents can't be understated here. And finding a mission-driven partner, it's almost like don't give up dating, right? The unicorn you're looking for is out there, and ultimately the persistence in looking for that mission-driven partner paid off and resulted in an FDA-approved therapy for children with high-risk neuroblastoma. And that's, all the late nights were worth it at that point.
What an incredible story. Thank you to the three of you for sharing this amazing, amazing journey of this incredible product that's helping just so many kids with a painful cancer. So congratulations again for being a finalist for the Better World Project. And Dr. Cheung, please continue doing what you're doing. And we look forward to seeing what else comes out of MSK.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And to the AUTM team, too, for the Better World Project. That was truly an honor for us. Thank you.
What an incredible journey from a lab bench in New York to a life-saving therapy for children around the world. This is a powerful reminder that tech transfer isn't just about patents and contracts. It's about hope, persistence, and saving lives. If you were inspired by this story, remember the Better World Project relies on your voice. You can learn more about Danyelza and other inspiring finalists at autumn.net. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Autumn on the Air.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at AUTM.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.